Dr. Brant Cortright, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's great to meet you, and you're a very interesting guy from what I can tell from your book. We haven't met in person, and so hello again. It's good to meet you. And we're going to be discussing your book and anything else, any highways and byways that come up in the conversation. And the title of this latest book of yours is Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. And but before we get into that, what would you like us to know about your background?
Well, I'm a professor emeritus at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I taught for a few decades. And I'm a clinical psychologist with a private practice in San Francisco and on Zoom these days. Also a coaching and consulting practice.
Yeah.
I have a few books out too.
I'm curious, where did you go to graduate school to get your PhD?
Union Institute.
Okay, the Union?
Yes.
Yeah, Union, okay. And so your book has a lot of dietary and nutritional information, and it seems like that's a big part of what you're doing. And I'm just curious, which came first for you? Was it the training in psychotherapy or whatever? How did you get into the depth and into the diet and nutrition part?
Yeah.
Which came first?
Yeah, that's interesting you put it that way, because we are psychophysical beings, right? We have a psychological existence and a physical brain side.
Yeah.
And in psychiatry, for example, or the medical model, depression is seen as a biological illness, right?
Right.
We need medication to make the person feel better. In psychology, on the other hand, depression is seen as a psychological disorder. Yeah. Unskillful behavior, poor emotion regulation, other things contribute to it. And it's that unskillful behavior that creates the brain changes we see in depression, right? It's like, what causes the brain changes? Is it a biological illness or is it psychological stuff? It's a chicken and egg thing, right? Depending on where you came from. And so I was always on the psychological side. I thought maybe 80%, 90% is psychological, a little bit biological, maybe. But then at a certain point, I began noticing certain things. I began noticing that my students and clients who were vegan were the most fragile. And also, I was a vegetarian for a while, and I began to feel more and more etheric, less and less grounded, more and more reactive. So I began just exploring more and more in diet, the whole area.
So this was after you already had your PhD. You were already licensed as a psychologist, and you were in practice. Okay, that's what I was curious about. Yeah.
So I always came down on the psychological side of this chicken or egg thing. And I've come to think of it as a chicken and egg thing, that they're both happening.
Sure.
That actually, the brain right now is under assault. It's like a more neurotoxic environment for the brain than ever in the history of the world. And I've come to think that psychiatric medication suppresses the symptoms, but it doesn't really heal the brain. It doesn't really heal and strengthen the brain.
Right.
And so I'm really trying to put together in the book both sides, because I think there are some common neural mechanisms behind anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline.
That was interesting to me.
Psychological mechanisms.
Yeah, that was interesting to me, because from the psychological point of view, I wouldn't have necessarily put them in the same basket.
Exactly. And, very different psychologically. Yeah.
Yeah. So you really build the case in the book for why and how they're in the same basket. So say a bit about that, or a lot, however much you want to say.
Okay, good. So. When our brain is functioning optimally, life feels good. It feels good to be alive. There's an intrinsic vitality. We have a kind of resilience. Life knocks us over. It's always going to, but we can bounce back quickly. There's a clarity to our thought. We remember things. We figure things out. We're creative. There's a joy in living. Not every moment, of course, but
Right.
there's essential vitality.
And you say that's kind of that should be more or less our natural state.
When the brain and the self are optimized, I think that is the state. That's right. Feels good to be alive.
Yeah.
But I think that in this current environment, there are so many neurotoxins that it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's like,
yeah, really.
So if you look at Wikipedia, it has 200 pages of neurotoxins in the environment, lists of 30
Oh my
on
goodness.
each page. That's 6,000 neurotoxins that are in the environment
goodness.
that have never been there before.
So all the stuff that we put on our lawn, the plastics that our food is delivered in, the plastics that we store our food in, the air, the fires that we've been experiencing here in Northern California.
Exactly
so
right.
It just goes on and on. And the fires, when I used to think about fire, I thought about, a wood house burning. But houses are full of plastics and all sorts of other chemically based materials. So we're breathing all of that in with that smoky air.
That's right. And 90% of the world's population lives in polluted air. And these very small particles, these 2.5 micron particles, are so small, they get into your lungs and into your bloodstream, and they actually cross the blood-brain barrier.
The nanoparticles.
Get into your brain, they act like little wrecking balls in the delicate neurons there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of cosmetic products and maybe food products, I'm not sure, are very excited about nanotechnology. And so they're using that technology of very fine, what would they be called? They're like little balls, I think of them.
Yeah. Nanoparticles. Yes, that's right. That's right. Pretty much everybody on Earth now has measurable levels of plastics in them, phthalates, these forever chemicals. These are all endocrine disruptors. Some of them many of them are carcinogenic. They also create havoc in the brain. Pesticides. Glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the history of the world. 300 million pounds are used every year in the United States.
Wow.
And it's not only an antibiotic, which means it begins to wipe out our microbiome, something we know is bad for mood and many other things, but it also opens up the tight junctions of the intestines. Now, the tight junctions are what keeps out the bad stuff and lets in the good stuff. So when the tight junctions open up, all these toxins come into the body that shouldn't be there, creating inflammation. And the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier operate with the same signaling molecules. So the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier open up also. And so these toxins begin to flow into the brain, also creating inflammation. So we get leaky gut, leaky brain. Now, UCSF did a study a few years ago that said that 93% of Americans have measurable levels of glyphosate in their system. If you eat strictly organically, you probably have very small amounts, but you probably still have some. If you live in the Midwest or the South, it's so used in agriculture there that it's in the dust. It's actually in the rainwater. So this idea that we can somehow poison the earth without poisoning ourselves, kind of a crazy idea to begin with, right?
Right. And you talk about tight junctions, and I've never even heard that term before, in the brain and gut literature that I read, which that I get mostly through these podcast interviews and preparing for them. So it's not like I read deeply in those areas. But how come I haven't heard of tight junctions before?
Most people haven't. I think it's newly coming out. There's a physician named Zach Bush who's done a lot of research in this. He has some very interesting podcasts and videos out there, and doing a whole thing around just really the health of the soil. because glyphosate kills the bacteria that are in the soil. It depletes our vegetables from minerals that we would otherwise get. It affects us in many, many ways.
Wow.
As well as affecting the tight junctions and creating this leaky brain and leaky gut syndrome as well.
It's not like we needed any more bad news right now. This is not good news you're sharing.
So again, it's death by 1,000 cuts. We don't feel one, we don't feel even 20 or 30, but after 100 or 200, we begin to falter. The brain gets more inflamed, there's more oxidation, there's more neurotoxins there, and the brain weakens. So I've coined this phrase, weakened brain syndrome, because I think most people, sort of the average brain today, is a weakened brain because of so many neurotoxins. And we see the results of this not only on the physical level in terms of chronic diseases, but on the mental health level. So anxiety rates, depression rates, and cognitive decline have skyrocketed in the last 50 years.
You correlate those with what you call the weakened brain.
Yes.
And are there also objective scientific measurements that go along with this weakened brain?
There are. There's some interesting blood tests that anybody can do, and I'd like to hold on to that for a second and come back to that.
Sure.
Build a little more context first, if we could. The weakened brain is, it's like, unless you are eating everything purely organically and you are eating really well, you are going to be degrading your brain. So one of the things that has been most interesting, I think, in the last certainly 20 years and probably a few decades before that, is this whole new field of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis.
Yeah.
Right. So we've known about neuroplasticity for some decades now, that the brain is always making new connections, connecting among itself, organizing itself in new ways, laying down new neural pathways. But up until the late 1990s, it was believed that we stopped growing new brain cells after our early 20s. Yeah. And after that, it was just one slow die off. But then they realized that no, actually, the brain grows new brain cells throughout the entire lifespan into old age.
Wow, that's encouraging.
It is. It's very encouraging. And it turns out that the rate of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity has a big impact on our mental health. So for a long time, they didn't understand what the significance of neurogenesis was. But then they discovered that actually, when you decrease neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, you bring about anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. So they actually first discovered this with depression, where, this whole, the antidepressants, the SSRIs, this big revolution in psychiatry, it was all based on this serotonin deficiency myth, right? That there's not enough serotonin in the brain, and so we need to increase the serotonin, fill up the tanks, and the person will be good. Although, if it's a biological illness, they need to do it for the rest of their lives. But what the neurogenesis researchers discovered is that actually what the effect of SSRIs is to increase the rate of neurogenesis. And it's this increased rate of neurogenesis that causes the person to come out of depression rather than the increase in serotonin. So, for example, they did an experiment where they didn't allow neurogenesis to occur, but the serotonin levels went up. No change in depression. Similar experiment, increased neurogenesis, no change in serotonin levels, no more depression. So the serotonin deficiency myth is actually well known by many neuroscientists and the pharmaceutical companies. But the pharmaceutical companies got a good thing going right now. I mean, it's a $15 billion a year industry, and they want to sell more product. I have a client whose cat is on Prozac at this point. 1 in 4 American women between 25 and 45 is on an antidepressant.
1 in 4.
One
Say
in
that
four.
again. Between
1 in
20.
4 between 25 and 45 American women
Wow.
is
Wow.
on an SSRI. Something seems wrong with this.
Yeah.
And the problem with antidepressants is that it then, the body, the brain then downregulates its own production of serotonin. So the person becomes increasingly dependent on the antidepressants, and going off of them becomes very difficult.
Oh, wow.
I'm not against antidepressants, for sometimes they can be a lifesaver.
Okay.
But I personally think they are so overprescribed that it's actually problematic at this point and serves to really cover up the deeper issue, because it doesn't bring about a deeper brain healing. That most psychiatric drugs, really what they do is they treat the symptoms as opposed to bring about a deeper brain healing.
Yeah. It's sort of denying the systematic or the system basis of the brain and the human body, and the intricacy of all of these systems within systems, because to assume one brain
Chemical.
is all you need to look at. That's probably always going to be a mistake.
That's
because
right.
there's this complex mix of systems within systems going on throughout the body.
That's exactly right. There are, over 50 known neurotransmitters at this point, and over 20 are involved in the regulation of emotion and mood.
Uh-huh.
Plus, there are hormones, there are neuromodulators, there are neuropeptides. It's a vastly complex, with multiple backup systems and self-regulating systems. It is such a complex stew that it is the height of hubris to say that making one chemical and making it higher is going to change everything. It's crazy to even think of those terms.
Yeah.
It is unfathomable complexity.
Yeah. And so, of course, it makes sense that food would be the answer, that since that's where we get all our chemicals from, pretty much, from food. And but there is this issue that you address, and I want to bring it up here, of faddishness and confusion. Most of us out there who haven't done as much study as you are pretty confused about, there's this diet and that diet, and how does one work their way through all that? How have you managed to find your way through that thicket?
Yeah, well, I've tried a lot of diets over the years, and a lot of it has been trial and error. But I have come to what I think of as the healthy brain diet. And I think it involves 4 different pillars.
Yes.
Think of those 4 pillars as neurogenic, ketogenic, anti-inflammatory, and gut-friendly. And I can go into each one of those a little bit more.
Let's do that. The names sound kind of familiar, like keto. I know keto is mentioned a lot these days. Yeah. And but before I read your book, I had absolutely no idea about that. So go ahead and take us through those 4.
So just one other quick experiment I want to just mention.
Good.
A neuroscientist by the name of Fred Gage down at the Salk Institute in San Diego was able to raise the neurogenic rate of mice by 5 times through this enriched environment, diet, and other things. And what he discovered was that these high neurogenic rate mice they weren't quite super mice, but they had big neurological advantages over their normal neurogenic rate peers. So they learned things faster, they remembered things longer, they figured things out faster, and they were protected against anxiety and depression.
That sounds very encouraging.
It is very encouraging because it can be increased at all ages of life. Even into old age, we can increase our neurogenic rate by 3 to 5 times, with profound effects on our mood and our cognition. So the first pillar here of the healthy brain diet is neurogenic. There are about 30 different compounds that I list in the book that have been shown to increase our rate of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. Probably the most well-known of these are omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay.
Christine Thuray at the University of London, a neuroscientist there, increased the rate of neurogenesis by 40% simply by adding omega-3s to the diet. And omega-3s consist of 3 different fatty acids: ALA, EPA, and DHA. ALA isn't terribly important. EPA is a strong anti-inflammatory, and DHA is the fundamental building block of the brain. The brain is made up of about 60% fat, and of that, a third to a half of it is DHA. So in building a better, healthier brain, we need good raw materials, and DHA is the fundamental building block, the fundamental raw material out of which the brain comes. They did an experiment with monkeys, feeding one group a low omega-3 diet and another group a high omega-3 diet. And then they looked at their brains in adulthood. And the low omega-3 diet monkeys had very simple, undifferentiated brains, whereas the high omega-3 diet monkeys had very complex, richly differentiated brains, almost like humans. So taking 3 to 4 grams a day of omega-3s is probably the single most important thing anybody can do for their brain, and probably everybody should be doing.
As a supplement?
As a supplement,
some sort?
that's right, because most people can't get enough through their diet.
Uh-huh.
It's also important to find a supplement that is molecularly distilled so it doesn't have mercury in it. Mercury is concentrated in fish, and mercury is, I think, the second most powerful neurotoxin known, second only maybe to plutonium. It just, a few molecules begins to just destroy neurons. So we don't want that built up in the brain.
Yeah.
And if you have high inflammatory levels, it's good to have a 1-to-2 ratio of DHA to EPA. But if your inflammatory levels are low, then you want a 1-to-1 ratio of DHA to EPA. And so one important test to do, blood test, when you go for your yearly physical, is called a high sensitivity C-reactive protein, high sensitivity CRP. That's a general measure of your inflammatory levels. And so if your level is 0.5 and below for a man, or 1.0 and below for a woman, then your inflammatory levels are in a pretty good place. If they are above that, which most people are, then you want to really focus on bringing those inflammatory levels down, because inflammation is behind pretty much every chronic disease, from cancer to heart disease to diabetes to also Alzheimer's, right? Inflammatory levels are sky high in Alzheimer's, and cognitive decline. And high inflammatory levels are also involved with depression and anxiety. These are also inflammatory conditions. So
what's the name of that blood test again? Would it be in a standard panel? Because I get a blood test pretty periodically.
It's often not included unless there is some reason to include it. It's called a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. There's a regular C-reactive protein, which isn't worth doing. You need to do the high sensitivity C-reactive protein.
Okay. Let's make a little note here on my pad.
Yeah. That's I think, something that everybody should do every year, just to check out your general inflammatory levels, because you want to bring those down. And inflammation, inflammation just chews up the inside of our blood vessels. It is one of the major contributors to chronic illness as well as to brain dysfunction.
Yeah, this is
so. So the omega-3s are helpful in that way, and the EPA to DHA ratio is also helpful for inflammatory levels.
Okay.
There are other things such as green tea extracts, ideally like 10 cups of green tea a day, but we don't want that much caffeine. So you can do a green tea caffeine-free extract that will give you that. Quercetin, hesperidin, luteolin, apigenin, these bioflavonoids act like Miracle-Gro for the brain. They increase our neurogenic rate and they work together. Like hesperidin, for example, this bioflavonoid derived from citrus fruits, its function is to keep new brain cells alive, right? So when new brain cells come into being, the brain often prunes them pretty quickly. And so, unless we use them. And so hesperidin begins to keep these new brain cells alive. So we get closer to 100% survival rate of new neurons. Other things like blueberries, for example, another fabulous brain food, increases the rate of new brain cells and of new connections being made with neuroplasticity. So your rate of, your neurogenic rate is probably the most important biomarker for brain health that most people have never heard of. And there are some people, all of these compounds increase your BDNF, your brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's many different neurotrophic factors, but the major one is BDNF. And most of these compounds increase BDNF. Some increase some of the other compounds. But it turns out that there is no current blood test for depression, for example. There's no brain scan for depression. But BDN levels have been shown to be correlated quite well with depression levels. Mm-hmm. And so if we can increase the rate of, increase the BDNF levels through natural means, then we get a natural antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and cognitive enhancing effect.
Now, do you increase those levels through foods or through supplements?
Well, both. Most of these things you can't get enough of through foods. Like it's hard to get enough green tea because you also want to avoid things that slow down the neurogenic rate. Yeah. And one thing that I hate to say this because so many people use it, caffeine. Caffeine slows down the neurogenic rate. Caffeine is kind of one of these mixed bags where the polyphenols are good for the brain and it can have a temporary effect on short-term memory, which is good. But over the long run, it is vasoconstricting, meaning it brings less blood into the brain, and we want more blood in the brain, not less. And it decreases the neurogenic rate over the long run, which is not good. But I understand nobody can be as pure as the driven snow, and we're all going to have things that are not perfect, and that's fine too.
My wife is very big on coffee. I didn't drink coffee for years and years. I didn't start drinking coffee until it started, when it was $10 a cup or 10 cents a cup, I didn't drink it. But when it became $3.50 at a fancy coffee shop, for something like a mocha, that's when I became a coffee drinker. And my wife it's like a cause with her. She's able to go to sleep, even drinking coffee at night. It doesn't get that effect from it to slow her down with the coffee drinking. And she seems to almost take offense if I'm not drinking coffee. So that's, and so she tells me about new things in the literature that come up a lot about the benefits of coffee.
Yeah, it's mixed. There are definite benefits. And I would say, ideally, you'd want to drink decaf. Because again, the polyphenols are really good for the brain, but the caffeine over time, I think on balance, not so great. Mm-hmm. Other things would be like a high sugar diet will cut your neurogenic rate in half. Also eating bad fats, like oxidized fats, like vegetable oils, for example. Vegetable oils are one of the worst things for the brain. They are highly inflammatory and they become oxidized really easily. So nobody should be cooking with any kind of vegetable oil. Even olive oil should really only be used on salads and used cold.
So instead of vegetable oils, what?
Cook with coconut oil, cook with lard, cook with butter or ghee. Those are great things to cook with. They've got a very high smoke point, and those are good. You need a certain number of certain amount of saturated fats as well, and those are good fats.
How is coconut oil not a vegetable oil? Isn't
Okay,
coconut of it? Yeah.
It's a nut, maybe. So
Okay, so nut oils are good.
Yeah, the vegetable oils have high linoleic acid, which is it has a high amount of omega-6s in it, which is highly inflammatory. Ideally, the rate of omega-3 to omega-6 is 1:1, and most people it's 1:20. And vegetable oils is one of the main causes of that.
Something in your diet and must be working well, because you're able to remember all of this. This stuff does not stick in my brain. Which
Well, when
probably
you're
means
interested in
I need
things,
it.
so
Yeah, that helps and you've been working at it for some years, and yeah. So, but I have to ask you, how many pills / supplements do you take a day?
I take a few handfuls.
A few handfuls.
I probably take 40 at this point. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
There's no way I'm going
it
to
gets
sell
crazy.
that to my wife.
Every year I add more and stop taking less. So it just adds up over the years.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So we're getting through the 4 here. I'm
That's right.
distracting
So
you
that's
every
neurogenic.
now and then. That's the one.
Neurogenic.
Okay.
The second one is ketogenic. So there's 2 phases to this diet, the healing phase and the maintenance phase. The healing phase is ketogenic. The maintenance phase is simply low carb. So a ketogenic diet is now being described by researchers as neuroprotective. So your brain and the cells of your body can operate either with sugar, glucose as energy, or with ketone bodies as energy. It turns out that glucose is a very dirty fuel. It creates inflammation, oxidation, a lot of toxic byproducts, but ketone bodies are a very efficient, clean fuel. And the brain actually prefers ketone bodies. Many neurological illnesses are now being experimented with a ketogenic diet. Epilepsy, for example, is being treated with a ketogenic diet. So to switch from being a sugar burner to being ketogenic means to cut down the amount of carbohydrates you do to very, very few, maybe 5 or 10% of your calories, and have most of your calories be good, healthy fats, moderate protein, and a lot of fiber, right? So most of what I eat is vegetables, and then healthy fats for most of the calories. When you are in what's called nutritional ketosis, meaning your blood levels are 0.5 and above, what happens is that your brain feels like it is operating on all cylinders. Like if you're just burning sugar, it's like you're on 4 cylinders. When you switch into being into nutritional ketosis, it's like there's a clarity, there's a stability, there's a kind of just ease of being, which comes into being, which I find quite extraordinary. And I think many people are. And I've found it to be the best anti-anxiety, antidepressant, and cognitive enhancing diet there is. So it's also being used with Alzheimer's patients to reverse Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is being called type 3 diabetes. And it's at one level, it's a dysfunction of glucose metabolism. And so switching the brain from being a sugar burner to being a ketone burner brings back cognitive functions that were offline when the person was just a sugar burner. And many people find that it's great to live on the ketogenic diet. I've been on it for a few years now, but at this point I do a cyclical ketogenic diet. So once a week I come off and do a carb refill. But what I find is when I go back to burning sugar, it's almost like my brain kind of slows down. It's kind of like taking a tranquilizer or something. It doesn't feel as good. So I've never actually felt anything from any of the diets I've been on, except for the ketogenic diet, which just feels good. And there are clinical trials underway with Alzheimer's, with cognitive decline, with Parkinson's, with many neurological disorders using a ketogenic diet. Many people find it hard to get into, and it's hard to give up carbs. It's hard to give up, mangoes and fruits. But if you simply reduce them and you get into ketosis, it feels so good that after a while, it's like it becomes self-reinforcing. So that's the second pillar, the ketogenic. Okay. And over time, it seems like there is a brain healing that goes on, both from the neurogenic side and the ketogenic side.
Something that I remember from your book, correct me if I'm wrong about this, that periodic fasting helps to put one in the ketogenic zone.
That's right. That's right. Okay. And ketones are also neurogenic. They also stimulate neurogenesis and neuroplasticity.
Okay.
So they reinforce each other. The third pillar is anti-inflammatory. So high levels of inflammation slow down our neurogenic rate to a crawl, really. So does oxidation, and those two often go together. So most people eat a pretty highly inflammatory diet. So what we want to do is switch to mostly vegetables, real food, not processed food. Processed food is going to also be inflammatory. And the book goes into a number of herbs and nutrients that also help lower inflammation. Things like black cumin seed oil or tart cherry extract. Or again, green tea is a curcumin, the active ingredient in turmeric, the most active ingredient in turmeric. Curcumin is a highly anti-inflammatory compound.
They sell big bottles of it at Costco now.
Yeah, yeah. It's a powerful anti-inflammatory. It's also very powerfully neurogenic. It does double duty in that regard. But curcumin is very poorly absorbed. And so it's good to do it either with phospholipids, such as egg yolks, or with piperine, which is a pepper extract, or micronized, meaning made into very, very small particles. So doing some anti-inflammatories and eating an anti-inflammatory diet is helpful. And then the fourth is gut-friendly. What we want to do is repair the gut, the tight junctions of the gut, as well as the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier. And we also want to increase microbial diversity. So in indigenous cultures, there are about 20,000 different strains of bacteria, right? We know that the microbiome, right, this whole ecosystem of bacteria that live in our intestines, they used to think there were more cells in the microbiome than cells of the body, and they've done a recount, and they now think it's about the same, that there's about 40 trillion cells in the body and 40 trillion bacteria in your microbiome, in your gut. Now,
wow, that's a big number.
Big number, that's right. It's a lot of them. And indigenous cultures have about 20,000 different strains. In the West, most people have about 10,000 different strains. Some people only have 1,000 different strains. Since 80% of our immune system is that microbiome, this is bad news for our immunity in the West. The more diverse an ecosystem, the more robust it is. The smaller it is, the less diversity, the more easily it collapses. And so with the overuse of antibiotics in the West, and with the use of pesticides like glyphosate, we have decimated the microbiome. Our microbiome has a lot to do with how we feel and how we think. This has only recently come into view with research studies. They took mice who were genetically bred to be anxious and mice who were genetically bred to be fearless. And they planted the microbiome in each. So they took the microbiome of the fearless mice and they put it in the anxious mice. And they took the anxious mice's microbiome and put it in the fearless mice. And the fearless mice became anxious and the anxious mice became fearless. That the microbiome trumps genetics, which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah.
There have been a number of studies looking at certain probiotics, and some of them, and the book goes into a few of these, but there's a few of them that are probably worth taking if you are either depressed or anxious, because they've been shown to reduce anxiety scores and depression scores by around 40 to 50%.
What are these things that we could take to reduce?
One of them is called Lactobacillus helveticus. Another one is Lactobacillus rhamnosus.
Would these be in the form of yogurt or not?
Sometimes it's in yogurt. Often they are in standalone probiotic capsules formulations.
Yeah.
So Swanson's, for example, makes a standalone rhamnosus. Life Extension makes a standalone helveticus and Bifidobacteria longum. Those two have been shown to reduce anxiety and depression scores. There have been other probiotics shown to increase cognitive scores in people with cognitive decline. So our gut health has a huge impact on our brain health and on our emotional health.
One of the things that strikes me as you say this is that at the ecological level of the planet, we're also learning the lesson that diversity is important, and we're losing diversity, which is really bad for the planet. So it's one of those sort of as below, as above kind of relationships.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So we also want to restore the tight junction integrity. There's a product out there called Ion Gut Health, which claims to do this. Zach Bush has some interesting research supporting that. There are other things like Lactobacillus plantarum, which does it. And there's some other probiotics which increase microbial diversity as well as healing the tight junctions. So although probiotics are good, and I think they are helpful for getting some of these bacteria in us, in a way, we want more than that, because it's kind of like monoculture when we take a probiotic. We're adding 1 or 2 or maybe just 5 with a probiotic. We want to increase by hundreds at a time. And so going into nature and just breathing the air, you're getting hundreds of bacteria that colonize the nasal passages, then it goes down into the throat, down into the gut. If you're swimming in the ocean, drink a little bit. You're going to be taking in hundreds of strains of bacteria.
Wow.
Going into new environments, traveling, you're taking in new hundreds of strains at a time. That is the single best way you can increase your microbial diversity, by being in nature, different natural settings.
Wow. We've had the wisdom to feel like we need to have nature around us and to be in nature, but I've never heard it put in these terms.
Yeah. Also, what they found is that being in nature increases your neurogenic rate. Being just in a room with very simple visual stimulation, that actually understimulating the brain lowers your neurogenic rate. And overstimulating the brain will do it too. You want to kind of Goldilocks optimal amount of stimulation. And that also increases your rate of new brain cell growth and new connections among neurons.
Okay, have we gotten to the fourth pillar yet? I'm not sure.
Gut friendly. So neurogenic.
Gut friendly, yes.
Yeah, neurogenic, ketogenic, anti-inflammatory, and gut friendly.
Okay, now you're a psychotherapist, and so I'm wondering I assume this is coming into the therapy that you do with people, right?
Yeah.
And so what proportion of your clientele are you using this information with?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is there a percentage?
Like
100% or?
Well, I offer it to everybody. Some people are interested in it and some people aren't. They're just really not interested. What I have been surprised at over the years is the proportion of people who, just as their brain heals and feels better, their emotional stuff disappears. Not that they don't have issues, not that they couldn't work on stuff, but they feel fine. Most people enter therapy because they're in pain, because they're, at least people I see, most people, they're hurting in some way. And so approaching it from both sides, the brain side and the psychotherapy side, I think most people can benefit from both. That is the ideal combination, to heal the brain and to heal the early wounding and to heal the self as well.
Okay.
But some people can do with just one or the other. Some people can do with just psychological healing, and many people, I'm really pretty surprised at the proportion, can just experience a very good benefit from the brain healing. So I offer it to everybody. Some people are more interested than others. I also have a consulting sort of Zoom practice. So some people just come to me for this from around the world because I've read my books. And so they just want consultation or coaching around brain health from this perspective.
In terms of psychotherapy, what people or what approaches have been your main influences?
Mm-hmm. I really integrate the two major streams of depth psychology. So the contemporary psychoanalytic approaches, relational approaches, as well as the humanistic existential approaches. I have a lot of training in Gestalt, focusing existential psychotherapy, as well as self-psychology, and this whole new relational paradigm. I would try to bring those two together, the relational and the somatic, humanistic.
Yeah, excellent. Now, is there, I'm sure that our listeners, viewers will be wondering, well, geez, do I have to take 40 pills a day to get on board with this stuff? Or, what's the minimal? Or do you have a kind of basic package?
I list sort of the top 10 in the book. And I think it's worth starting off with that and sort of seeing how it goes. It's a very individual thing for each person. Each person's anxiety, each person's depression, each person's cognitive decline, it's a very specific thing. There's a unique body, heart, mind, spirit signature to each of these, meaning to each of these. And so what each brain needs to heal is very individual. And so there's a lot of just experimentation that's needed. Some people can't do some of these. I can't do some of these supplements because it makes me speedy or it makes me jittery or my body just doesn't react to it well. So all the things that are necessarily good for the brain, I can't do. And I think that's true with everybody. So we just do the things that feel right to us, that feel good, and which it seems like it's having an effect. Things are feeling better over time.
Well, I want to let people know that I've kind of chosen to direct you towards the biological, nutritional part of your book, and there's a lot of psychological interventions that are discussed and recommendations and so on in the book as well. So as we begin to kind of wind down here, I wonder if there's a final message you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, I think it would be that our brains are a sense of self, but our brains in particular are capable of functioning at a much higher level than we think they are. Most people are operating at a lower level without really realizing it because you adapt to it and you don't really know that you are functioning on a lower level, except you maybe feel more anxious, more prone to depression, you're not remembering things as well. You just don't feel as much. You may have brain fog. You may not feel as much just vitality and zip in life. But that when the brain gets at a higher level, you realize, oh my God, I was operating at 90% and missing the best 10% of life.
Yeah.
I think Dickens was right. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. It's never been a worse time for the brain and the self. It's never been a better time either, because we now know more about how to optimize brain functioning than we ever have. We also know how to work with healing the early traumas and woundings of the self in order to create a more integrated, coherent, cohesive self. And so I think that this is a time when we can live at a much higher level than our ancestors ever did, but we are actually living at a lower level for most people than we need to. And that is behind, I think, this huge mental health epidemic that we are seeing.
Okay, well, Brant Cortright, that's an excellent wrap up. And I really want to thank you for being my guest on Shrink Wrap Radio today.
It was my pleasure.